Imagine that you're writing a story about characters in a fictional novel, right? So the characters go around in the world that you describe, and they have thoughts to themselves, and you write about those thoughts, and they do things, and you write about the things that they do. And maybe one character is named Reuven, and the other character is named Shimon. And Reuven, at some point in your story, gets angry at Shimon and picks up a rock and bashes in Shimon's head and kills him. So now you've written a story about a murder, right? And the question is, does Reuven have moral responsibility for what he did? And clearly, at one level, you're the author of the story, right? You control everything that happens in the story. You decided how to write the story. There's nothing about the story that's hidden from you. There's nothing about what happens in the story that's beyond you, because you're determining the content of it. And it's a unfettered expression of your will as the author of the story. But it doesn't really make sense to say, therefore, that Reuven is not responsible for murdering Shimon, because it's obvious, I think, in this example, that responsibility is a construct that exists within the story. Of course, authors are not responsible for the actions of the characters in their story in a way that somehow enters into the story and impinges on whether or not Reuven is responsible. The notion of responsibility is Reuven has thoughts, Reuven has intentions. Those are things that he's aware of. Those are things that he can talk to others about. And he takes actions that others can observe and that he has an account of as well. And when you take those kinds of factors together, those things that come from within the construct of the story, the definition of responsibility is something that is a function of those things within the story. It's a property of the characters in the story, and it's a property of the story. It is not something that disappears because the story has an author, right? Because you can write stories about people and they can act differently. And there could be a different story about Reuven and Shimon where instead Reuven is picking up a rock and he's standing on a cliff or something and he trips and accidentally drops the rock off a cliff and it falls on Shimon's head and kills him. And that's a different story than if Reuven got angry and hit him in the head deliberately. And it's obvious what the difference is in responsibility, again, with a proper definition of what responsibility means, by a function of what we can write in the story about people's thoughts and their intentions and the actions that they took and the results of them. So this game that people play in the kind of theistic argument against moral responsibility, or let's say against the existence of free will and therefore against moral responsibility, where they say, well, if God is omniscient and omnipotent, then he determined everything, including what you did, which means you're not responsible for determining what you did, and therefore you can't be responsible, and also you don't have free will. That's a distortion or a perversion of the meaning of free will. What free will means is, again, a construct within the story that from the perspective of the one acting, he knows things about his intentions. He can talk about things about his intentions if interviewed. And he knows things about the actions that he takes, and other people know things about the actions that he takes. And those are the kinds of factors out of which we construct the idea that there's such a thing as my will and things that I intended, and then there's the actions that I took, and there's how correlated were the actions that I took with the will that I had, which I could express in words if I wanted, and how correlated are the results of what happened with what I imagined to be the results that I wanted to prove out when I took certain actions, right? All of those things are things that could be studied by interviewing people who are characters within the story, but they are factors that are within the construct of the story. And the question of whether someone has a will and whether that will expresses itself in action, all of that has to do with things happening amongst and between and inside the characters of the story, even if the author is writing the story and saying Reuven was angry at Shimon or Reuven accidentally let go of the rock, right? Whether the author writes one of those things or another thing changes whether Reuven's responsible in the story, but the fact that there's an author of the story does not alter Reuven's responsibility in the story. It's a silly thing to say, well, Reuven's just a character in a story, so he's not responsible for anything. That's a distortion or a perversion, as I said. This is a story about a character who is responsible for his actions. That is the way responsibility and free will have clear meaning. And anything else is this bait and switch where you say, aha, because the story has an author, therefore the apparent free will leading to action of the character in the story is in fact an illusion. Now, that is kind of a simple parable, let's say, that is not quite as complex as the situation that we have if we talk now theologically from the perspective of Tanakh. What's the situation that we face with HaKadosh Baruch Hu being Borei Olam, the creator of the world? And I think the point is there that it's just a bit more complicated because why? Because yes, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the author of the story. Right? There's no other way of saying about Hashem that he really has unlimited knowledge and power, like knowledge of and power over the world, unless you give him that free and unfettered authorship, right? Where everything that is and everything that happens is within his grasp and is an expression of his will. Like the moment you step back from that complete and total description and you say, well, this stuff is an expression of his will, but this other thing I'm not so sure. If it's not an expression of his will, then what is it, right? You've graduated to dualism. You've now said there's more than one God in some sense. There's some power, there's some factor that is not HaKadosh Baruch Hu that is determining something, and it's beyond his reach to control or influence or know or whatever you want to say. There's a serious problem with that. We can't go that direction. So if we can't go that direction, then he is the author. But why is this a different story than usual? Normally, you pick up a novel, you read it, and it's all about the characters in the story. Right? The author wrote the story, but what you read about is the people within the construct of the story. So the author might have been living in Wisconsin in 1950, and the story might take place in Egypt 3,000 years ago, right? And near the twain shall meet. One has nothing to do with the other than that you know, actually, that the book was written by a person in Wisconsin. What's different about the story, so to speak, of the reality that we experience is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu insists not only on being the author, but also making himself a character in the story, right? He wants the characters in his story to be aware of his authorship, and he wants them to seek dialogue with him, and he's going to write into their actions different varying degrees of success and failure in seeking relationship with him. And he's also going to write into the story different ways that he tries to put into the world messages that give his characters a chance to hear from him what he has to say to them, right? And why he's writing that story is not our business at some level, or at least this is not something we should treat as an easy question to answer where it should be obvious, right? That's the part where I would say it might be that remains beyond our comprehension forever. It might be that that's in the realm of his unattainable kedusha, his separate and special and different nature, because he's separate and special and different from everything else that is by virtue of his oneness. And so if it's the case that we look at it this way as a story that's being written, it sounds a bit odd at first, because you say, if he's really writing the whole story, why does he do that? Why is that important to him? What's the difference for him between writing the story and not writing the story? What would there be if he didn't write the story? We have no idea. If he does write the story, now the question is, what does he get out of it? Why would he care, in a sense, if he's the author and he has total control, total artistic control, so to speak, from start to finish, then what is it worth to him that the story's written this way and not that way? And that is something I don't think we should rush to assume it should be obvious how to figure out the answer to that question. But what I think we do start to get a sense of is that there at least is some notion of complexity now to understanding how such a story has to unfold. Because if HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants, on the one hand, to write the story with total artistic control, so to speak, but also to make himself a participant in dialogues within that same construct, then he's going to demonstrate his judgment of his own characters through the way he writes about what happens to them as they talk to him, right? There's a sense in which it's possible for him to write a piece of the story and say, I'm going to tell the character that I want him to do a certain thing. Maybe it's Hashem talking to Avraham and saying, all right, go take Yitzchak and sacrifice him on Har Moriah, right? The binding of Isaac. And then Avraham goes off and does something. And at one level, when he's doing that, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is writing the story, right? He's saying, okay, and then Avraham went over here. And then there's this dialogue between Avraham and Yitzchak, right? From the perspective of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, outside of the construct of the story, it's all up to him, right? And that's how he wanted to write it. The same way he wants to write the Torah a certain way, he wants to write the world a certain way. And we don't get around that ever. However, the point is that the way that he writes it creates the possibility of relationship for the character, from the character's perspective, with him, right? It's still possible, since he is a speaking character in the story as well, right? He communicates with the character of the story. So from the perspective of the character, going into the construct of the story, where, as we said before, it's within the construct of the story that we have choice, that we have intention, that we have a will of our own, that we make choices that express some desire or motivation. We take action, and then we produce consequences, right? From within the story, the character in the story can have a will, can make choices, can see what happens, and can experience the world in such a way that it becomes possible through the events in that world to have a relationship with the author, especially because the author has actually written into the story that he has every so often very explicit things he has to say, right? Because he gave us a book that we can read that tells a lot of things about what he has to say. And we also maybe can see in the events of our life that he writes into every little thing that happens to us, some ways he wants to make signs to us that he's watching and he's involved and he cares about what we do, right? So it's a marvelous construct when viewed in this way, because we don't usually write stories about people this way. We don't write books this way where we say, well, I'm the author and I want to be involved. I want to write about characters developing a relationship with me, and I'm gonna show them things in their life that are going to help them on a path. And I'm going to understand something about the path that they're on. It would be very difficult, actually, to write a story like that was any good, because you need to understand something about what it's like to engage in that kind of dialogue while also being outside of it all and having this total control. But if you think of HaKadosh Baruch Hu as being in that situation in his relationship to the created world, then I don't think there's really any remaining issue in what we call the paradox of free will and moral responsibility or free will and determinism, or all these different versions of it. And there's nothing that's touched by any issue in physics or in natural laws or whatever that we now would introduce. Because, of course, if he's writing the story, he's perfectly welcome to write a story and perfectly free to write a story that is about a world that has things like gravity in it, and it has things like sunlight in it and whatever else, because he wants a story to take place in a world that has predictability in it. Because it turns out actually there's no real possibility of meaning in a world that isn't partly predictable. So he's going to introduce the subject of whatever is happening in a setting where there are things that tend to happen a certain way, usually, like apples tend to fall off of trees, etc. And there's no additional problem created for us philosophically by the fact that now there are natural laws tending to govern what seems to usually happen in this story world, right? Anything that we can deal with once we have dealt with the issue of Hakadosh Baruch Hu being in charge, it doesn't become more or less complicated when we additionally try to look at it through the lens of what we were saying, the sort of more naturalistic way people try to make the argument. That's in a sense a special case where Hakadosh Baruch Hu wants his story world to have some seemingly reliable natural laws in it. That's actually pretty necessary. It's pretty hard to imagine a world that doesn't have that, that has an interesting story in it. But it doesn't change his freedom to write any part of it differently than the laws might have dictated if he so chooses. So I think that if we've dealt with the construct from the standpoint of what if Hashem is in control of everything, we've really dealt with every possibility. And so we're just talking now about a situation where we don't worry anymore that free will is some kind of thorny problem because we properly understand it to be a word that only has meaning for within the construct of a story where there are people with perspectives that allow them to give testimony about their own will and intention, and that allow them to have the experience of seeing their actions correlate with that will. There's no meaning to free will other than that, and there's obviously no damage done to the idea of moral responsibility within the construct of the story simply by observing that there's an author outside the story who's decided how to write it. And so for anyone who wants to say, oh yeah, free will and moral responsibility are an illusion because there's laws of physics or because there's a God controlling everything, they need to recognize that they're beginning the conversation essentially by doing some kind of logical equivalent of assuming 2 equals 3 and then basing everything else on top of that. Like they've started off with a bit of logical nonsense that they've hidden in a sort of sleight of hand of switching perspectives and changing the definition of a term midstream. And if we can just avoid that kind of sophistical smoke and mirrors game at the beginning, then we don't really have a problem with free will going forward. And the question instead just becomes, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu is writing the story in this way where he's also seeking relationship, what are we supposed to do? And how do we make decisions about how to do that? And yes, he's the one, so to speak, perhaps writing the story, and he knows how we're going to decide what to do. And he chose that so that the story would tell a certain tale and make a certain point. But from our perspective, we don't know how the story plays out. And which character we are in the story is for us to choose, the same way when an author writes a novel, it's a choice for the character to make before he makes it. And that doesn't diminish the meaning of it or the significance of it, but rather it just roots that meaning and that significance within the perspective of the human being. And I think to close off the point, speaking in philosophical terms, this lines up, I think, most neatly with observations made by Rav Joseph P. Soloveitchik in his analysis of the Garden of Eden, because I believe in his famous work, The Lonely Man of Faith, because at the end of the day, part of the point of the fact that there are these 2 creation stories, one of which is very, the 7 days, and seems very much to emphasize the speech and the perspective of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the other one, which is about the human beings in the Garden of Eden. I'm maybe making an error, and it may have been Rav Jonathan Sachs, perhaps commenting on the Holy Man of Faith, who made this point, or it might have been originally Rav Soloveitchik himself. But in any case, the idea is that we can't do without at least two perspectives, right? When the Torah talks about the truth that it has to tell us, it will not simply speak to us from this perspective of the creator, of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, nor will it simply emphasize the perspective of the human being, but rather it insists on telling about creation twice because it has to tell us about both perspectives because we are missing something if we only have one. And I think that notion in the Torah that you cannot express the whole truth without more than one perspective is a very deep and profound one across the whole Torah. And at some level, the desire to boil everything down to one perspective, I would say, is an aesthetic fetish of Western philosophy and Greek philosophy that provides the motivation for this kind of shell game we were talking about with changing the definition of free will midstream in order to create this apparent paradox. Because the idea is that it's the refusal to accept a truth that requires at least two perspectives, the insistence that the truth must come from the one perspective that sees all that is true. That very kind of Hellenic idea, and that which goes down through Christianity into Enlightenment philosophy, is what is creating this problem for us. So I don't even want to necessarily say that it's like, when I was saying it's a shell game, it's like it's suggesting it's all a charade and someone's just trying to trick you. There are clearly people who sincerely believe that this is a philosophical problem. But the reason they do is because of the incorrect insistence of Hellenic and Western Enlightenment philosophy on the elimination of all perspectives but one when you have arrived at the final truth. And the Torah fundamentally rejects that and would say, no, you need at least two perspectives. And so, from the perspective of the human being, there is free will because we're characters in the story. And clearly, from HaKadosh Baruch Hu's perspective, there is no such thing as our freely chosen will because he's writing the story. But also, from his perspective, there's no such thing as the responsibility that we have because we don't have responsibility out in his world or from his perspective. That responsibility is a thing that exists within the construct of our perspective in our world. And he's very interested in that story and in the possibility of responsibility in the story that he's writing.